Marcus heard the desperate screams of dying horses through the blizzard and knew that going out there with one leg would probably kill him. But the sound of those chains rattling in the wind as 2,000-pound animals fought for their lives made staying inside impossible. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sky had turned an ominous shade of gray that afternoon, the kind of gray that promised nothing good. Heavy clouds rolled across the horizon like a dark blanket being pulled over the world, and the wind had already begun to howl through the bare trees with a sound that seemed almost alive. The first snowflakes were falling, innocent enough at first, but everyone who lived in this part of Montana knew what was coming. The weather reports had been clear for days. A massive winter storm was bearing down on the region, one of those storms that shut down highways, trapped people in their homes, and turned the landscape into a frozen wasteland where nothing survived without shelter. In the outskirts of a small rural town called Riverside, where most of the residents made their living from agriculture or small businesses, people were preparing. Hardware stores had sold out of generators and emergency supplies days ago. Families stocked up on food, water, and firewood. Farmers brought their livestock into barns, double-checking every latch and reinforcing every door. Everyone understood the danger. Everyone knew that when nature unleashed its fury in these parts, you either prepared or you suffered the consequences. But on the old Henderson property, at the edge of town where the land stretched out into miles of empty fields bordered by dense forest, two massive horses stood alone in an open pasture. They were draft horses, the kind bred for heavy labor with bodies built like mountains and hooves the size of dinner plates. One was black as midnight with a thick mane that fell across his powerful neck. The other was a pale cream color, almost white, with a gentler expression in his eyes but the same incredible size and strength. Both horses wore heavy chains around their necks, chains that were attached to thick metal posts driven deep into the frozen ground. The property had once been a working ranch, a place where the Henderson family raised cattle and horses for 3 generations, but time had not been kind to the Hendersons. Financial troubles, family disputes, and a series of unfortunate events had left the ranch abandoned nearly 2 years ago. The main house stood empty, windows boarded up, paint peeling from the walls. The barns had fallen into disrepair, their roofs sagging under the weight of neglect. Most of the animals had been sold off or relocated, but somehow these 2 magnificent horses had been left behind. Perhaps someone had intended to come back for them. Perhaps they had simply been forgotten in the chaos of the ranch's collapse. Whatever the reason, they remained, and as the months passed, they learned to survive on their own. During the warmer months, they grazed on whatever grass grew in the pasture. A small creek ran through the property, providing them with water. They found shelter from summer storms under the sprawling branches of old oak trees. But now, with winter closing in and a historic storm approaching, their situation had become desperate. The grass was long gone, buried under the first layers of snow. The creek had frozen over. And those chains, which might have seemed like a cruel joke during better times, now became potential death sentences. The horses could move within a limited radius, but they couldn't reach the barn, they couldn't break free. They were trapped in the open, exposed to whatever nature would throw at them. As the afternoon wore on, the wind grew stronger and the snow fell harder. The temperature dropped rapidly, and visibility decreased with each passing hour. The black horse, whom we might call Thunder for the way his hooves sounded when he moved, pawed at the ground nervously. He could sense the danger in the air, that primal understanding that all animals possess when something terrible approaches. The pale horse, whom we could call Ghost for his ethereal coloring, pressed close to his companion, seeking warmth and comfort. They had been together for years, these 2 giants, and they depended on each other, not just for companionship, but for survival. Several people from town had driven past the Henderson property in recent days. Some noticed the horses. A few even commented to their families about it over dinner. "That's terrible," they said. "Someone should do something." But in the rush to prepare for their own families, to secure their own homes and protect their own animals, the two chained horses on the abandoned ranch became just another sad story, another problem that belonged to someone else. After all, the Henderson property was private land. The family was involved in complicated legal proceedings. Who had the authority to go onto that property and remove the horses? Who had the time and resources to take on two massive draft horses with nowhere to put them? The excuses came easily, and as the storm drew closer, the two horses remained exactly where they were, chained and helpless. By evening, the storm had arrived in full force. The wind screamed across the open fields with terrifying intensity. Snow fell so thick that you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The temperature plummeted to dangerous levels, the kind of cold that could kill an exposed human in hours, and an animal not much longer. Thunder and Ghost huddled together, their bodies pressed close, trying desperately to share what little warmth they could generate. They had survived cold nights before, but nothing like this. The chains around their necks seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, a constant reminder of their imprisonment. Every gust of wind felt like knives cutting through their thick coats. Ice began to form on their manes and tails. Their breath came out in great clouds of vapor that froze almost instantly in the air, and in that moment, as the storm raged and two magnificent creatures faced what seemed like certain death, they did the only thing they could do. They cried out. Their calls were desperate, mournful sounds that carried across the frozen landscape, pleading for help that might never come. 3 miles away from the Henderson property, in a small cabin that sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, Marcus Weber was trying to ignore the pain in his leg. The phantom pain, the doctors called it. Phantom because the leg wasn't there anymore, lost to an IED in Afghanistan 7 years ago. But the pain was real enough, especially on nights like this when the cold settled deep into his bones and reminded him of everything he'd left behind. Marcus was 42 years old, though some days he felt twice that age. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face carried lines that spoke of experiences no one should have to endure. But his eyes, dark brown and intense, still held a spark of determination that even war and loss couldn't extinguish. Marcus had moved to Riverside 2 years ago, after his marriage fell apart, and he couldn't bear to stay in the city anymore. Too many people, too much noise, too many reminders of the man he used to be before the war changed everything. He'd found this cabin advertised online, a fixer-upper on 5 acres of land, isolated enough that he could have the peace and quiet he desperately needed. The place had been in rough shape when he bought it, but Marcus had spent those 2 years slowly repairing it, learning to work with his prosthetic leg, finding purpose in the simple act of building something instead of destroying things like he'd been trained to do. The cabin was modest, just 3 rooms and a bathroom, but it was his. He'd insulated the walls himself, replaced the old wood stove with a more efficient model, and built a small workshop in the back, where he made furniture to sell at the local farmer's market. It wasn't much of a living, but combined with his disability pension, it was enough. More importantly, it gave him a reason to get up in the morning. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to dark places it shouldn't go. Tonight, as the storm howled outside, Marcus sat in his living room near the wood stove, trying to focus on sanding a chair leg. The heat from the stove felt good against his skin, and the rhythmic motion of the sandpaper usually helped calm his mind. But something felt off. He couldn't concentrate. An uneasiness had settled over him, a feeling he recognized from his time in the service. That sixth sense that soldiers develop, the one that tells you something is wrong even when you can't see or hear the threat. He'd learned to trust that feeling in Afghanistan. It had saved his life more than once. Marcus set down the chair leg and the sandpaper, then rose awkwardly from his seat, reaching for the crutches he still sometimes needed when his prosthetic was bothering him. He moved to the window and looked out into the storm. He could barely see anything through the sheets of snow and the darkness. His truck sat in the driveway, already buried under several inches of white. The trees beyond bent and swayed in the violent wind. It was a night when any sensible person would stay inside, hunker down, and wait for morning. But then he heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the roar of the storm, but unmistakable once he focused on it. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the creaking of trees. It was an animal sound, desperate and afraid. Marcus pressed his ear closer to the cold glass of the window, straining to hear. There it was again, louder this time. The cry of a horse, maybe more than one. They sounded terrified. They sounded like they were dying. Marcus's first instinct was to dismiss it. Probably some rancher's horses safe in a barn somewhere, just spooked by the storm. It wasn't his problem. He had his own troubles to worry about. He should just go back to his chair, back to his woodworking, back to the life of careful isolation he'd built for himself. But the sound came again, and this time it seemed to pierce right through him. Those horses weren't safe in a barn. Something was desperately wrong. He thought about his old unit, the guys he'd served with. They'd had a saying, "No one left behind." It didn't matter if you were hurt or scared, or if the odds were impossible. You didn't leave your brothers to die. Marcus had lived by that code for years, and even though he was no longer a soldier, even though these weren't men but animals, something in that code still resonated deep in his chest. Someone was in trouble. Someone needed help. And apparently he was the only one who could hear them. Marcus moved away from the window and looked at his prosthetic leg propped against the wall. On nights this cold, it was uncomfortable to wear. The socket didn't fit quite right in extreme temperatures, and the pain could be excruciating. He could barely walk normally on a good day. The idea of going out into that storm, trudging through deep snow, trying to help animals that probably weighed over a ton each, was beyond foolish. It was suicidal. He could freeze to death. He could fall and injure himself further. He could get lost in the storm and not find his way back. Any rational person would make excuses, would convince themselves that someone else would handle it, would decide that their own safety had to come first. But Marcus had stopped being a purely rational person the day that IED went off. He'd learned that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing. Sometimes being human meant putting yourself at risk for others, even when it made no logical sense. Those horses were crying out for help, and he'd be damned if he was going to ignore them. He grabbed his prosthetic and began strapping it on, gritting his teeth against the discomfort. Then he reached for his heavy winter coat, his boots, his gloves, and the flashlight he kept by the door. He had no clear plan. No idea what he'd find when he followed those cries. No guarantee that he could actually help. But he knew he had to try. Because in the end, that's what separated him from the people who drove past those horses and did nothing. That's what made him still feel human, despite everything the war had taken from him. Marcus opened the door, and the storm rushed in like a living thing, cold and violent and unforgiving. He stepped out into the night, leaving the warmth and safety of his cabin behind, following the desperate cries of animals he'd never met, driven by something deeper than logic or self-preservation, driven by the simple truth that when someone calls for help, you answer. The cold hit Marcus like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his eyes water instantly. The wind was stronger than he'd anticipated, strong enough to make him stagger as he made his way toward his truck. Snow pelted his face with tiny ice crystals that stung like needles. His prosthetic leg already ached from the cold, the metal components conducting the freezing temperature straight through to where flesh met artificial limb. But he pushed forward, each step deliberate and careful. Falling now would be more than embarrassing. It could be fatal. He reached his truck and pulled open the door, grateful that it wasn't frozen shut. The interior was ice cold, and when he turned the key, the engine groaned in protest. "Come on, don't do this to me now," Marcus muttered, pumping the gas pedal. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a rough rumble. He let it idle for a moment, knowing he should let it warm up, but also knowing that every second he waited was another second those horses were suffering. Marcus put the truck in gear and began backing out of his driveway, his windshield wipers working frantically to clear the snow that was already accumulating on the glass. Visibility was terrible. The headlights seemed to illuminate nothing but a wall of white. He'd lived in Montana long enough to know how to drive in snow, but this was different. This was the kind of storm that made even experienced drivers second-guess their decisions. He gripped the steering wheel tighter and focused on the barely visible road ahead. The cries of the horses guided him like a beacon. Every few moments he'd roll down his window despite the cold, listening for their direction. The sound was heartbreaking, growing more desperate with each call. They were to the east. He was certain of that now. But east covered a lot of territory, and in these conditions, he could easily drive right past them without seeing them. He needed to get closer, needed to pinpoint their location before the storm got even worse. Marcus drove slowly, methodically, scanning the landscape for any sign of structures or fencing that might indicate a property with horses. His military training kicked in, that ability to stay calm and focused even in chaos. He'd operated in sandstorms in Iraq, in mountain conditions in Afghanistan. This was just another hostile environment to navigate. The fact that his body wasn't what it used to be didn't change the fundamental skills he'd learned. Assess the situation, adapt to the conditions, complete the mission. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Marcus spotted something through the snow. A mailbox, half buried but still visible, marking the entrance to a long driveway. He slowed to a crawl and peered at it. The name Henderson was barely legible on the side. Henderson. He knew that name. The abandoned ranch. He'd heard people in town talk about it, how the family had left everything behind when they lost the property, how it had become an eyesore that no one wanted to deal with. If there were horses out here, they'd been abandoned along with everything else. Marcus turned onto the driveway, his truck lurching through the deep snow. The driveway hadn't been plowed in years, and several times he felt his wheels spin, struggling for traction. He kept his speed steady, avoided sudden movements, and prayed he wouldn't get stuck. The last thing he needed was to be stranded out here with no way to help those horses or himself. The driveway seemed to go on forever, winding through overgrown brush and past collapsed fencing. Finally, through the swirling snow, he saw the outline of buildings. A house, dark and abandoned, barns in various states of decay, and beyond them, in an open pasture, two massive shapes that could only be horses. Marcus parked the truck as close as he could get to the pasture and grabbed his flashlight. The moment he opened the door, the wind nearly ripped it from his hands. He forced it shut behind him and began making his way toward the horses, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The snow was deeper here, coming up past his ankles, making each step a challenge. His prosthetics sank into the drifts, and he had to work twice as hard to pull it free with each stride. Pain shot through his residual limb, but he ignored it. Pain was something he'd learned to live with. It no longer controlled him. As he got closer, Marcus could see the horses more clearly, and what he saw made his heart sink. They were enormous, draft horses built for strength and endurance, but even their massive bodies couldn't withstand exposure to a storm like this indefinitely. Ice had formed on their manes and coats. Their bodies trembled with cold and exhaustion, and around their necks, thick chains led to metal posts driven into the ground. They were chained. Someone had left these magnificent animals chained in an open field with no shelter, no food, and no escape. Thunder saw him first. The black horse lifted his head and let out a sound that was part whinny, part cry for help. Ghost responded in kind, both horses pulling against their chains, trying to reach this stranger, who represented their only hope. Marcus felt anger surge through him, hot and fierce. What kind of person did this? What kind of human being left living creatures to suffer like this? He'd seen cruelty in war, had witnessed the worst of what people could do to each other, but somehow the deliberate abandonment of these innocent animals felt just as heinous. "Easy, boys," Marcus called out, trying to keep his voice calm despite the rage building inside him. "Easy. I'm here to help." He approached slowly, carefully, not wanting to spook them despite their obvious desperation. Horses this size could be dangerous if they panicked, even if they didn't mean to be. One kick from those massive hooves could kill him instantly, but as he drew closer, Marcus saw something in their eyes that made his throat tighten. Not aggression or fear, hope. These horses understood that he was here to help them. They were smart enough, aware enough to recognize a rescuer when they saw one. Marcus reached Thunder first, placing a gloved hand on the horse's massive neck. The animal was shaking violently from the cold, his coat soaked through beneath the layer of ice. Marcus shone his flashlight on the chain around Thunder's neck and examined how it was attached. The chain was secured with a heavy padlock, industrial grade, not something he could break with his bare hands. He moved to Ghost and found the same setup. Both horses were secured with chains and locks that would require tools to remove. He looked back toward his truck, calculating. He had bolt cutters in his toolbox, tools he'd accumulated over the years for various repairs around his property. If he could cut through these chains, the horses could at least move freely, could find some shelter among the trees or in one of the barns if the doors weren't locked. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be better than leaving them chained in the open. Marcus made his decision quickly. He'd go back to the truck, get the tools he needed, and free these horses. Then he'd figure out the rest. The journey back to the truck felt twice as long as the trip out. Marcus's leg was screaming at him now, every nerve ending where his prosthetic attached sending signals of protest to his brain. The cold had seeped through his layers of clothing, and he could feel his fingers growing numb inside his gloves. But he kept moving, driven by the image of those two horses trembling in the storm, waiting for him to return. He'd made them a promise by showing up. He wasn't about to break it. When Marcus reached the truck, he had to use both hands to wrench open the toolbox in the bed. Ice had formed around the edges, and his frozen fingers struggled with the latch. Finally, it gave way, and he rummaged through the contents until he found what he needed. The bolt cutters were heavy-duty, designed for cutting through thick metal. He'd bought them years ago for a fencing project and hadn't used them much since. Tonight, they might save 2 lives. He also grabbed a coil of rope, thinking he might need it to lead the horses somewhere safer, and a knife from his emergency kit. Better to have tools and not need them than the other way around. With the bolt cutters slung over his shoulder and the rope and knife secured in his coat pockets, Marcus began the trudge back through the snow. Each step was harder than the last. His prosthetic was not designed for this kind of extreme use, and he could feel it shifting slightly in the socket, rubbing against his skin in ways that would leave him raw and bleeding later. But later didn't matter. Right now, those horses mattered. Right now, getting them free was the only thing that counted. When he reached Thunder and Ghost again, both horses seemed to recognize him. They nickered softly, their breath coming out in great plumes of vapor. Thunder took a step toward Marcus, as much as his chain would allow, and the gesture was so trusting, so hopeful, that Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. These animals had been abandoned, left to die in the worst possible way, and yet they still had faith in humanity. They still believed that a stranger in the night might save them. Marcus wasn't a religious man, not anymore. But in that moment, he felt something close to sacred responsibility settle over his shoulders. "All right, big guy, let's get that chain off you," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. He positioned the bolt cutters around one of the links in Thunder's chain, near where it attached to the post rather than near the horse's neck. He didn't want to risk cutting too close and accidentally injuring the animal. The bolt cutters were good quality, but these chains were thick, designed to hold creatures that weighed nearly a ton. It was going to take strength and leverage. Marcus braced himself, positioning his feet as best he could in the snow, and squeezed the handles of the bolt cutters with everything he had. His muscles strained, his hands ached. For a moment, nothing happened, and he feared the chain was too thick, that his tools weren't enough for the job. But then he felt it give slightly, the metal beginning to deform under the pressure. He adjusted his grip, found a better angle, and squeezed again. This time, there was a sharp crack that rang out even over the howling wind, and the chain link split apart. Thunder felt the release immediately. The weight around his neck was still there, but the tether to the post was gone. He could move. The big horse took a tentative step forward, then another, testing his newfound freedom. He shook his massive head, the remnants of the chain clanking against his chest, and let out a sound that might have been relief. Marcus allowed himself a brief smile before moving to Ghost. 1 down, 1 to go. The pale horse watched Marcus approach with those gentle eyes and stood perfectly still as Marcus positioned the bolt cutters on his chain. This time, Marcus knew what to expect. He found the right angle more quickly, applied pressure in the correct way, and within a few minutes, Ghost's chain also gave way with that same satisfying crack. Both horses were now free from their anchors, though they still wore the chains around their necks like terrible necklaces, reminders of their imprisonment. Marcus stood between the two massive animals, breathing hard from the exertion, his body trembling from cold and exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. Getting the horses unchained was only the first step. They needed shelter. They needed food and water. They needed warmth. The storm was intensifying, and staying out here much longer would be dangerous for all of them. Marcus scanned the property, his flashlight beam cutting through the snow. The barns were the closest option, but were they even accessible? Were the doors unlocked? Was there anything inside that could help these animals survive the night? "Come on, boys," Marcus said, starting to walk toward the nearest barn. To his surprise and relief, both horses followed him without hesitation. Thunder walked on his right side, so close that Marcus could feel the heat radiating from his massive body. Ghost followed slightly behind, his hooves making deep impressions in the snow. They trusted him completely, these giants who had every reason to distrust humans. It was humbling and heartbreaking at the same time. The barn was about 100 yards away, and those 100 yards felt like miles. Marcus's leg was barely functioning now, each step sending jolts of agony through his body. He stumbled once and nearly fell, but Thunder seemed to sense his struggle. The big horse moved closer, and Marcus found himself leaning against that solid, warm body for support. It was absurd in a way, being supported by one of the creatures he was supposed to be rescuing, but Marcus was grateful for it. They were helping each other now. That's what survival sometimes required. When they finally reached the barn, Marcus's heart sank. The main door was secured with a rusted chain and padlock, similar to what had been on the horses, but older and more corroded. He could cut through it, but it would take time and energy he wasn't sure he had left. He moved along the side of the barn, searching for another entrance, and found a smaller door that wasn't locked. The wood was swollen and stuck, but with some effort Marcus managed to force it open. The hinges shrieked in protest, but the door swung inward, revealing darkness beyond. Marcus shone his flashlight inside. The barn was in better shape than he'd expected. The roof seemed intact, which meant it would be dry and provide protection from the wind. There were several stalls, though they were empty and hadn't been cleaned in years. Old hay bales were stacked in one corner, moldy and unusable, but the space itself was sound. It wasn't much, but it was infinitely better than being exposed to the storm outside. He turned back to the horses. "All right, this is home for tonight," he told them. "Let's get you inside where it's safe." He led them through the smaller door one at a time. Thunder went first, having to duck his massive head to fit through the opening. Ghost followed without hesitation. Once both horses were inside, Marcus pulled the door shut behind them, blocking out the worst of the wind and snow. Inside the barn, the difference was immediately noticeable. The howling wind became muffled, distant. The temperature was still cold, but without the wind chill factor. It felt almost warm by comparison. Marcus leaned against the wall for a moment, catching his breath, feeling the adrenaline that had carried him this far beginning to fade. His entire body ached. His prosthetic leg felt like it was on fire where it attached to his residual limb. His hands were so cold he could barely feel his fingers, but the horses were safe. That was what mattered. He shone his flashlight around the barn more carefully now, taking inventory. The space was larger than it had appeared from outside. There were 6 stalls along one wall, all empty. A loft overhead still held some old hay, though getting up there to assess its condition would be impossible for him tonight. Along the back wall, he spotted what looked like an old water trough, frozen solid but potentially useful if he could get water to it somehow. There were also remnants of old tack hanging on hooks, leather so dry and cracked it would be useless, but the hooks themselves might come in handy. Thunder and Ghost stood in the center of the barn, their massive bodies still trembling from the cold. Ice continued to cling to their coats, and the chains around their necks hung heavy and cruel. Marcus knew he needed to do something about those chains. The horses were free from the posts, but wearing heavy metal around their necks couldn't be comfortable, and if the chains caught on something, they could cause serious injury. He moved closer to Thunder, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Easy, boy. I need to look at this chain, see if I can get it off you completely." Thunder lowered his head slightly, allowing Marcus access. Up close, Marcus could see that the chain was secured with a different mechanism than the ones attached to the posts. This one had a clasp, industrial and rusted, but it looked like something he might be able to work with. He pulled off his gloves, knowing he'd need dexterity for this, and immediately regretted it as the cold air bit into his exposed skin. His fingers were stiff and uncooperative, but he worked at the clasp, applying pressure, trying to find the release mechanism. For several minutes, nothing happened. The clasp was frozen, corroded, stubborn. Marcus's fingers began to go numb. He was about to give up and try a different approach when he felt something give. The clasp shifted slightly. Encouraged, he worked at it more persistently, and finally, with a screech of protesting metal, it came free. The heavy chain fell away from Thunder's neck and landed in the snow and dirt of the barn floor with a solid thunk. Thunder immediately lifted his head higher, stretching his neck, clearly relieved to be free of the weight. One down. Marcus moved to Ghost, his hands now so cold he could barely feel them. He knew he should put his gloves back on, warm his fingers, but he also knew that if he stopped now, he might not have the strength or willpower to continue. Ghost stood patiently as Marcus worked on his chain. This one was even more stubborn than Thunder's had been, and for a while Marcus thought he might actually have to use the bolt cutters on it, cutting it away rather than unclasping it. But finally, after what felt like an eternity of struggling, this clasp too gave way. Ghost's chain joined Thunder's on the barn floor. Marcus stepped back, flexing his frozen fingers, trying to restore circulation. Both horses were now completely free. No chains, no tethers, nothing holding them captive. They could walk out of this barn right now if they chose to, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed close to Marcus, as if understanding that they were safer together than apart. As if recognizing that this man who could barely stand had risked everything to help them. Marcus sank down onto an overturned bucket that sat near one of the stalls, his leg finally giving out on him. The pain was excruciating now, and when he reached down to touch his prosthetic, he could feel dampness that he knew was blood. The socket had rubbed his skin raw, probably creating wounds that would take weeks to heal. He'd pushed himself too far, too hard, and his body was making him pay for it. But looking at Thunder and Ghost, free and safe from the storm, Marcus couldn't bring himself to regret it. The horses moved closer to him, curious about this human who had appeared in their darkest hour. Thunder lowered his massive head and sniffed at Marcus's shoulder. Ghost did the same from the other side. Their breath was warm against his cold face. Marcus reached up with one trembling hand and touched Thunder's nose, feeling the soft velvet texture of it. "It's okay now," he whispered. "You're going to be okay. I won't let anything else happen to you." But even as he said it, Marcus knew the night wasn't over. The immediate crisis had been solved. The horses were out of the storm, free from their chains. But they still needed food and water. They were suffering from exposure and probably dehydration. Come morning, there would be questions about ownership, about what to do with two giant draft horses that technically belonged to property Marcus had no right to be on. There would be veterinary bills if the horses needed medical attention. There would be complications he couldn't even imagine yet. Marcus didn't care. Sitting there in that freezing barn with two horses who should have died tonight, he felt more alive than he had in years, more purposeful. In Afghanistan, he'd lost his leg trying to save his brothers in arms. Some he'd saved, some he hadn't. The ones he couldn't save haunted him still, appearing in his dreams, asking him why he hadn't been faster, stronger, better. But tonight, he'd saved someone. Two someones. And maybe in some small way, that balanced the scales just a little bit. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the barn walls. Snow found its way through cracks in the wood, creating small drifts in corners. It would be a long night. Marcus knew he should go back to his truck, drive home, take care of his injured leg, get warm and dry. But he also knew he couldn't leave Thunder and Ghost alone. Not yet. They'd been abandoned once. He wouldn't do it to them again, even temporarily. So he stayed, sitting on that overturned bucket, watching over two massive horses in an abandoned barn while a record-breaking storm raged outside. And for the first time in 7 years, Marcus Weber felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd found something worth fighting for again. The hours crawled by. Marcus dozed occasionally, jerking awake whenever he started to slump too far to one side. The cold was relentless, seeping into his bones despite his layers of clothing. But every time he considered leaving, he'd look at Thunder and Ghost and the thought would evaporate. They'd settled down somewhat, lying in the straw and dirt, their bodies close together for warmth. They looked peaceful, or as peaceful as two traumatized horses could look. Occasionally one would lift its head and look toward Marcus as if checking to make sure he was still there. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if even the sun was hesitant to face what the storm had wrought. Gray light began filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, and Marcus could see his surroundings more clearly now without the flashlight. The barn was in worse shape than he'd realized. The roof had several holes that had allowed snow to drift inside, creating white patches on the floor. The walls were weathered and worn, some boards loose or missing entirely, but it had served its purpose. It had kept Thunder and Ghost alive through the worst of the storm. Marcus tried to stand and immediately regretted it. His leg had stiffened during the night, and the pain that shot through him when he put weight on his prosthetic was so intense it made his vision blur. He gritted his teeth and forced himself upright, using the wall for support. He couldn't afford to be weak right now. The horses needed him. They'd made it through the night, but they were far from safe. They needed food and water. They needed proper medical attention. And Marcus needed to figure out what to do next. Thunder and Ghost stirred when they heard Marcus moving. Both horses got to their feet, a process that took effort given their size and the cramped space of the barn. They looked better than they had last night, Marcus noted. The ice had melted from their coats, and their shivering had stopped. But they were still clearly in distress. Their ribs showed more than they should, indicating they'd been underfed for quite some time. Their coats were dull and unkempt. Ghost had what looked like sores on his legs, possibly from the chains rubbing against him. Thunder's hooves needed attention from a farrier. These were horses that had been neglected for months, maybe longer. Marcus moved to the barn door and pushed it open. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Snow covered everything in a thick white blanket, pristine and beautiful in the early morning light. The sky was clear now, pale blue and cloudless, as if apologizing for the violence of the night before. But Marcus knew that beauty was deceptive. The temperature had dropped even further during the night. This was the kind of cold that killed. The horses might have survived the storm, but without proper care, they could still succumb to exposure or starvation. He pulled out his cell phone, hoping against hope that he might have service out here. The screen showed no bars. Of course not. The Henderson property was too remote, too far from the nearest cell tower. If he wanted to call for help, he'd need to drive somewhere with reception, but that meant leaving Thunder and Ghost alone again, and the thought made him uneasy. What if something happened while he was gone? What if they tried to leave the barn and got into trouble? What if someone from the Henderson family showed up and tried to chain them again? Marcus looked back at the horses. They were watching him with those intelligent, trusting eyes. They'd placed their faith in him last night, and he couldn't betray that faith now, but he also couldn't take care of them alone. He needed help. He needed someone who knew about horses, who could assess their condition properly. He needed supplies that he didn't have. Most of all, he needed to figure out the legal situation. Could he just take these horses? Were they still owned by the Hendersons? Would he get in trouble for trespassing and removing them from the property? The practical questions swirled in his mind, but underneath them all was a simple truth. He wasn't leaving Thunder and Ghost. Whatever it took, whatever obstacles he had to overcome, he would make sure these horses never suffered like this again. He'd figure out the details later. Right now, he needed to focus on their immediate needs. Water was the most pressing concern. The horses had gone through a night of intense stress and freezing temperatures. They needed to rehydrate. Marcus remembered seeing that old trough along the back wall. He moved to examine it more closely. The trough itself was solid, made of galvanized metal that had lasted through years of neglect. But it was bone dry and coated with dust and cobwebs. Even if he could get water to it, it would need a thorough cleaning first. He went back outside to his truck, the journey easier now that he could see where he was going. His toolbox yielded a few useful items: a plastic bucket, cracked but still functional, a couple of rags he used for cleaning. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He also grabbed a protein bar from his emergency supplies and forced himself to eat it. He needed to keep his strength up, and he hadn't eaten since before the storm. Back in the barn, Marcus set to work cleaning the trough as best he could. It was slow going with his frozen hands and aching body, but he was methodical about it. The horses watched with interest, Ghost coming close to investigate what Marcus was doing. The pale horse nudged Marcus's shoulder gently, and Marcus paused to stroke his neck. "You're going to get water soon, buddy. Just hang in there a little longer." Once the trough was as clean as he could make it, Marcus faced the next challenge. Where would he get water? The pump outside the barn was frozen solid. The creek that ran through the property would be iced over. He'd have to melt snow. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only option. He took his bucket outside and filled it with clean snow from a drift near the barn. Then he brought it inside and set it near where the horses were standing, hoping their body heat would help it melt faster. While he waited, Marcus examined the hay situation more carefully. The bales in the corner were indeed moldy and unusable. Feeding bad hay to horses could make them sick, possibly fatally so. But up in the loft, visible through gaps in the floorboards, there appeared to be more hay. Marcus looked at the ladder leading up to the loft. It was old and rickety, and with his leg, climbing it would be dangerous. But what choice did he have? He positioned himself at the base of the ladder and tested the first rung carefully. It held. He pulled himself up, using mostly his arms, trying to put as little weight as possible on his prosthetic. Each rung was a challenge, but he kept climbing. When he reached the loft, he was breathing hard and sweating despite the cold. But what he found there made the effort worthwhile. Someone, probably years ago, had stored several bales of hay up here. They were covered with tarps, protected from the worst of the weather and moisture. Marcus pulled back one of the tarps and examined the hay beneath. It was dry, still green, and smelled fresh. This hay was good. This hay. He pushed 2 bales to the edge of the loft and let them drop to the barn floor below. Thunder and Ghost startled at the sudden movement, but settled quickly when they realized what was happening. Marcus climbed back down the ladder, moving even more carefully now that exhaustion was really setting in. Once he was safely on the ground, he cut open one of the bales with his knife. The horses needed no further invitation. They moved to the hay immediately and began eating with an urgency that broke Marcus's heart. How long had it been since they'd had a proper meal? Marcus stood watching Thunder and Ghost eat, a profound sadness settling over him. The way they devoured the hay, barely pausing to breathe, told him everything he needed to know about how they'd been surviving. They'd been slowly starving, scraping by on whatever dead grass they could reach within the radius of their chains. No one should have to live like that. No living creature deserved that kind of neglect. He felt the anger rising in him again, hot and righteous, directed at whoever had made the decision to simply abandon these magnificent animals. By the time the horses had eaten their fill, the snow in Marcus's bucket had melted enough to provide them with some water. It wasn't much, maybe a gallon at most, but both horses drank eagerly. Marcus knew they needed much more. Draft horses this size could drink 10 to 15 gallons of water a day, especially after being dehydrated. He'd need to make multiple trips, melting snow batch after batch until he could get the pump working or find another water source. It would take hours, maybe all day, but there was no alternative. As Marcus prepared to take the bucket outside for another load of snow, he heard something that made him freeze. The sound of an engine. A vehicle was approaching on the long driveway. Marcus moved to the barn door and peered out carefully. A pickup truck was making its way through the snow, heading straight for the property. It was older, a work truck with rust spots on the fenders and a snowplow attachment on the front. Behind the wheel, Marcus could make out a figure. Though he couldn't identify who it was from this distance, his first instinct was worry. Had someone reported him for trespassing? Was this the property owner coming to confront him? But as the truck drew closer and pulled to a stop near his vehicle, Marcus recognized the driver. It was Bill Hutchins, the owner of the feed store in town. Marcus had bought supplies from him a few times over the past 2 years. Bill was in his 60s, weathered and gruff, but fair in his dealings. He climbed out of his truck slowly, his breath visible in the cold air, and spotted Marcus standing in the barn doorway. "Morning," Bill called out, his voice carrying across the snow. "Saw your truck tracks leading out here when I was plowing the main road. Got worried someone might be in trouble. Everything all right?" There was genuine concern in his voice, not accusation. Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. He stepped out of the barn, closing the door behind him to keep the horses from being seen just yet. He wasn't sure how to explain the situation, but he knew he needed to be honest. Bill seemed like the kind of man who would understand. "Found something last night," Marcus said, his voice rough from the cold and lack of sleep. 2 draft horses. They were chained in the pasture, no shelter, no food, left to die in the storm. I couldn't just leave them. Bill's expression changed immediately. His jaw tightened and his eyes hardened. Draft horses chained. He shook his head slowly. The Henderson horses. I'd heard rumors they left some animals behind, but I thought someone had taken care of it months ago. Damn fools. Bill walked toward the barn and Marcus didn't try to stop him. When Bill opened the door and saw Thunder and Ghost, his reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went red with anger. "What kind of person does this?" he muttered. "These are beautiful animals. Look at them. They're half-starved." He turned to Marcus. "You did the right thing getting them out of that storm. They'd be dead now if you hadn't." Marcus felt a wave of relief. "I wasn't sure if I should have," he admitted. "Technically, this is private property. I was trespassing. I cut through the chains. I took hay from the barn. I know there could be legal trouble." Bill waved a hand dismissively. "Legal trouble? For saving 2 animals from dying? Anyone who'd press charges over that is someone this town doesn't need. Besides, I know some folks at the county. We'll get this sorted out proper. Right now, these horses need care, and that's what matters." Bill walked around Thunder and Ghost, examining them with the practiced eye of someone who'd been around horses his whole life. "This one's got sores from the chains," he said, pointing to Ghost, "and both of them need their hooves done bad. Probably need deworming too. And shots. When's the last time they saw a vet?" Marcus shook his head. "I have no idea. Probably not since the family left." Bill pulled out his cell phone, checked it, then swore under his breath. "No signal out here. Look, I need to head back to town anyway. Let me make some calls. There's a vet, Sarah Chen, who's good with horses. I'll see if I can get her out here today, and I'll bring back proper feed and water containers. You planning to stay with them?" Marcus nodded without hesitation. "I'm not leaving them alone again." Bill studied him for a moment, taking in Marcus's exhausted appearance, the way he was favoring his left leg, the determination in his eyes. "You look like hell, Marcus. When's the last time you slept? Or ate a real meal?" Marcus managed a tired smile. "I'll be fine. The horses are what matter." Bill shook his head but didn't argue. "All right, I'll be back in a few hours with supplies and hopefully the vet. You've got my respect, son. What you did last night took courage. A lot of folks would have driven right past." After Bill left, Marcus returned to his task of melting snow for water. It was tedious work, but it gave him time to think about what would happen next. Bill's support was encouraging, but there would be complications. Someone would have to take responsibility for Thunder and Ghost. They'd need a proper home, someone with the resources and knowledge to care for them. Marcus's cabin was too small, his property not set up for horses. He could barely take care of himself most days. How could he take on the responsibility of 2 giant draft horses? But even as these practical thoughts ran through his mind, Marcus knew the truth. He was already responsible for them. The moment he'd heard their cries in the storm, the moment he'd driven through the blizzard to find them, he'd made a commitment. These weren't just horses anymore. They were Thunder and Ghost, individuals he'd fought to save. They trusted him. They'd looked to him for help, and he'd answered. Walking away now would be like abandoning his brothers in Afghanistan. It would be a betrayal of everything he believed in. Thunder approached Marcus as he was refilling the bucket with snow. The big horse lowered his head and nuzzled Marcus's shoulder, a gentle gesture that carried profound meaning. Marcus reached up and stroked Thunder's face, feeling the soft hair, the warmth of living flesh. "You're stuck with me now, buddy," Marcus said softly. "I don't know how we're going to make this work, but we'll figure it out together." Thunder exhaled, his breath warm against Marcus's cold face, and in that moment Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose, connection, a reason to keep fighting. Ghost joined them, not wanting to be left out. Both massive horses surrounded Marcus, and he found himself standing between them, one hand on each of their necks. They were so big they made him feel small, but not in a bad way. In a way that reminded him he was part of something larger than himself. These horses had survived abandonment and neglect. They'd endured a storm that should have killed them. They were fighters, just like him. And fighters didn't give up. True to his word, Bill returned 3 hours later with a convoy of help that surprised Marcus. Behind Bill's truck came 2 other vehicles. One was a white SUV with veterinary markings on the side. The other was a smaller pickup carrying what looked like enough supplies to sustain a small farm. As the vehicles pulled up to the barn, Marcus felt a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. He was grateful for the help, but he also worried about losing control of the situation. What if the vet decided the horses needed to be taken somewhere else? What if the authorities got involved and decided Marcus had overstepped his bounds? Bill climbed out first, followed by a woman in her mid-30s who emerged from the veterinary SUV. She was Asian, with shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing heavy winter gear over scrubs. Her face was serious but kind, the face of someone who dedicated their life to helping animals. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen," Bill announced as they approached. "Best large animal vet in 3 counties. Sarah, this is Marcus Weber. He's the one who saved those horses." Sarah extended a gloved hand and Marcus shook it. "Bill told me what you did," she said, her voice warm with approval. "Driving out in that storm, cutting them free. That took real courage. Now let's see what we're working with." She headed straight for the barn, carrying a large veterinary bag. All business now. Marcus and Bill followed her inside, where Thunder and Ghost were finishing the last of the hay Marcus had given them. When Sarah saw the horses, her expression shifted from professional assessment to barely concealed anger. "Who chains draft horses in an open field with winter coming?" she asked, her voice tight. "This is criminal neglect. These animals could have died." She set down her bag and approached Thunder slowly, speaking to him in soft, reassuring tones. "Hey there, big guy. I'm here to help. Let me take a look at you." Thunder, who had been wary of strangers in the past, seemed to sense that Sarah meant no harm. He stood still as she began her examination, running her hands over his body, checking his legs, examining his hooves. Sarah worked methodically, checking Thunder first and then Ghost. She listened to their hearts and lungs with a stethoscope. She checked their teeth and gums. She examined the sores on Ghost's legs where the chains had rubbed. She felt their ribs and assessed their body condition. All the while, she talked to them quietly, maintaining that calm, professional demeanor that good veterinarians develop over years of practice. Marcus watched, impressed by her skill and her obvious compassion for the animals. After what felt like an hour but was probably closer to 30 minutes, Sarah stepped back and turned to Marcus and Bill. Her expression was grave. "Okay, here's what we're dealing with. Both horses are severely underweight. I'd estimate they've lost about 200 pounds each from what their healthy weight should be. They're dehydrated, though the water you've been giving them has helped. Ghost has multiple lacerations and sores from the chains, some of which are starting to show signs of infection. Both horses have overgrown hooves that need immediate attention from a farrier. Their teeth need floating. They're going to need deworming and a full vaccination series." She paused, letting the information sink in. "But here's the good news. The storm didn't cause any frostbite or permanent cold-related injuries that I can see. Their internal organs seem to be functioning normally. With proper care, nutrition, and time, these horses can make a full recovery. They're strong animals. Draft horses are incredibly resilient. You got to them in time, Marcus. If you'd waited even one more night, we'd be having a very different conversation." Marcus felt relief wash over him so strongly it made him dizzy. "They're going to be okay?" Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving. "They're going to be okay. It'll take months of rehabilitation, but yes, they'll recover." Marcus had to sit down on the overturned bucket again, his legs suddenly weak. He hadn't realized how much he'd been holding his breath, waiting for her verdict. Bill cleared his throat. "So what do they need?" Sarah pulled out a notebook and started writing. Immediately, I'm going to give them both antibiotics and pain medication. I'll clean and treat Ghost's wounds. I'm going to give them some vitamin injections to help with the malnutrition. Long-term, they need high-quality hay, grain feed formulated for horses recovering from starvation, and constant access to clean water. They need shelter from the elements, and they need someone to monitor them daily for the next few months at minimum. She looked directly at Marcus. Are you planning to take responsibility for these horses? The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Marcus knew what she was really asking. Was he prepared for the financial burden, the time commitment, the sheer work of rehabilitating two massive horses? Was he capable, given his own physical limitations, of providing the care they needed? Every rational part of his brain screamed that he should say no, that he should let someone else, someone more qualified and better equipped, take over. But when Marcus looked at Thunder and Ghost, when he saw how they were watching him with those trusting eyes, waiting to see what he would decide, there was only one answer he could give. Yes, he said firmly. I'm taking responsibility for them. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure they're cared for properly. Sarah nodded as if she'd expected that answer. Then we need to talk about practicalities. This barn isn't suitable for long-term housing. It's better than nothing, but it needs repairs. The roof leaks, the walls have gaps. You'll need to either fix this place up or find somewhere else to keep them. Bill jumped in. I might have a solution for that. My brother-in-law, Tom Reeves, has a ranch about 10 miles from here. He's got empty stables since he sold most of his cattle last year. Good facilities, plenty of pasture. I called him while I was in town, told him about the situation. He said Marcus could board the horses there until something more permanent gets figured out. He won't charge much, just enough to cover feed costs. Marcus looked at Bill, surprised by the generosity. Why would he do that for someone he doesn't even know? Bill shrugged. Because it's the right thing to do. And because Tom's a veteran too. Marine Corps. Vietnam. He understands about not leaving anyone behind. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. The kindness of these people, strangers really, who were rallying to help him help these horses, was almost overwhelming. Sarah continued writing in her notebook. Okay, so we'll plan to move them to Tom's ranch once I've finished treating them today. In the meantime, Bill brought supplies. There's feed, water buckets, blankets, medical supplies, everything you'll need for the next few days. I'm also going to leave you with medications and instructions for administering them. She looked up at Marcus. This isn't going to be easy. These horses need someone dedicated, someone who won't give up on them even when it gets hard. From what Bill told me about last night, I think you're that person. What about the legal situation? Marcus asked. The horses technically belong to the Henderson estate. Sarah's expression hardened. I'll handle that. I'm filing an animal cruelty report with the county. Based on the condition of these horses and the evidence of neglect, I can get temporary custody transferred. Once that's done, we can work on getting you permanent ownership if you want it. The Hendersons abandoned these animals. They don't deserve to get them back. Bill nodded in agreement. And I'll spread the word around town about what happened. Trust me, once people hear this story, you'll have more support than you know what to do with. This community takes care of its own, and those horses are part of this community now. Marcus sat there, absorbing everything they were telling him. 24 hours ago, he'd been a solitary man, living a quiet, isolated life. Now he was at the center of a rescue operation involving veterinarians, ranchers, legal proceedings, and community support. It was overwhelming and terrifying, and somehow exactly right. Over the next several hours, Marcus watched as Sarah worked on Thunder and Ghost with the kind of expertise that comes from years of dedicated practice. She cleaned Ghost's wounds carefully, her movements gentle but efficient. The pale horse stood patiently, seeming to understand that Sarah was helping him despite the discomfort. She applied antibiotic ointment to each laceration, then wrapped the worst ones with protective bandaging. All the while, she talked to Ghost in that same soothing voice, telling him what a good boy he was, how brave he was being. Thunder received similar attention. Sarah checked him thoroughly for any injuries Marcus might have missed in the dark. She found several abrasions and what looked like an old bruise on his shoulder, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time. Both horses received injections of antibiotics, vitamins, and anti-inflammatory medication. Sarah worked with practiced efficiency, but Marcus noticed how she paused occasionally to simply stroke their necks or rest her forehead against their massive shoulders. She cared deeply about these animals. This wasn't just a job for her. While Sarah worked, Bill and the driver of the third vehicle, a young man he introduced as his nephew Danny, began unloading supplies. They brought in bags of specially formulated feed for malnourished horses, blocks of mineral salt, multiple water buckets, horse blankets to help keep Thunder and Ghost warm, and boxes of medical supplies. Danny, who couldn't have been more than 20, kept shaking his head in disbelief as he worked. "I can't believe someone just left them like this," he said to Marcus. "How could anyone be so cruel?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He'd seen cruelty in war, had witnessed humans inflicting terrible suffering on each other, but there was something particularly heartbreaking about the abandonment of animals who depended entirely on humans for their survival. Thunder and Ghost hadn't chosen to be domestic animals. They hadn't asked to be bred for work, to be owned by people. But once humans had made them dependent, those humans had a responsibility to care for them. The Hendersons had failed that responsibility in the most egregious way. By early afternoon, Sarah had finished her initial treatment. She stood back, wiping her hands on a cloth, and surveyed her work with satisfaction. "That's all I can do for now," she announced. "I'll come back in 3 days to check on them and change Ghost's bandages. In the meantime, they need rest, food, and water, lots of water. Don't let them gorge on feed, though. Their systems aren't used to regular food anymore. You'll need to feed them small amounts several times a day rather than large meals. I've written out a feeding schedule for you." She handed Marcus several pages of detailed instructions along with bottles of medication and syringes. "It's a lot, I know," she said, seeing the slightly overwhelmed expression on his face. "But you handled last night. This is just the follow-through. You can do this." Marcus took the papers and nodded, determination replacing doubt. He'd figure it out. He had to. These horses were counting on him. Bill clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Tom's expecting you tomorrow morning. I'll come by with my trailer to help transport Thunder and Ghost. It's big enough to handle draft horses. Danny here will follow in your truck so you have a way to get home after." Marcus looked at the younger man, who gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up. "We've got you covered," Danny said with a grin. "This is like the coolest thing that's happened in this town in years. You're basically a hero." Marcus felt uncomfortable with that word. Heroes were people who did extraordinary things. He'd just done what anyone should do when they encountered suffering, but he didn't argue. Let them think what they wanted. All that mattered was that Thunder and Ghost would be safe and cared for. That was the only victory that counted. After Sarah and Danny left, Bill stayed behind for a few more minutes. He leaned against the barn wall, watching as Marcus fed Thunder and Ghost their carefully measured portions of grain. The horses ate slowly, savoring each bite, so different from their desperate hunger that morning. "You know," Bill said quietly, "I've lived in this town my whole life. Seen a lot of people come and go. Most folks keep to themselves, don't want to get involved when there's trouble. What you did last night, that was special, that took character." Marcus kept his eyes on the horses. "I just couldn't leave them," he said simply. Bill nodded. "I know. That's what makes it special. Most people would have found a reason why it wasn't their problem, but you didn't." He pushed off from the wall and headed toward the door. "Get some rest tonight, Marcus. You look like death warmed over. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." After Bill left, Marcus was alone with Thunder and Ghost again. The afternoon light was fading, and the temperature was dropping once more. But inside the barn, with the horses fed and treated, with warm blankets draped over their backs, everything felt different than it had the night before. There was hope now. A path forward. Marcus spread out one of the extra blankets on the cleanest patch of floor he could find and sat down, his back against the wall. His leg was throbbing, his body ached from exhaustion, but his mind felt clearer than it had in years. Thunder and Ghost settled down near him, lying in the straw with their legs folded beneath them. They looked content, or as content as horses who'd been through what they'd endured could look. Marcus watched them in the fading light, these gentle giants who'd survived against all odds. He thought about his own survival, how he'd made it through the war, through the loss of his leg, through the dissolution of his marriage, and the dark times that followed. He'd been surviving, but had he really been living? These horses had given him something he didn't even know he'd lost. Purpose, connection, a reason to keep fighting that went beyond just getting through another day. In saving them, perhaps they'd saved him too. It was a thought that would have seemed ridiculous to him just yesterday. How could helping two horses change anything fundamental about his life? But sitting there in that barn, feeling the weight of responsibility but also the lightness of hope, Marcus understood that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. He must have dozed off, because when he opened his eyes, it was full dark outside and Thunder was nuzzling his shoulder. The big horse's breath was warm and smelled of hay. Marcus reached up and stroked Thunder's face, feeling the soft whiskers around his mouth. "Thanks for the wake-up call, buddy," he murmured. Thunder snorted softly and returned to his spot next to Ghost. Marcus checked his watch. It was nearly 8 in the evening. He'd slept for almost 3 hours. He forced himself to stand, his body protesting every movement. He needed to check the horses' water, make sure they were warm enough, give them their evening medications. The work of caring for them didn't stop just because he was tired. But as he went through the tasks Sarah had outlined, Marcus found he didn't mind. This was meaningful work, work that mattered. Every bucket of water he provided, every blanket he adjusted, every gentle word he spoke was an investment in the lives of two creatures who deserved so much better than what they'd gotten. That night Marcus slept in the barn again, refusing to leave Thunder and Ghost alone. Tomorrow they'd move to Tom's ranch, where there would be proper facilities, and maybe Marcus could finally go home to his own bed. But tonight, he stayed. It felt important somehow, this vigil. These horses had spent so long alone and afraid. The least he could do was ensure they never felt that way again. The morning of the move arrived bright and clear, the kind of winter day where the sun reflects off the snow so brilliantly it hurts to look at. Bill showed up early with his massive horse trailer, a double-axle rig designed specifically for transporting large animals. Tom Reeves followed in his own truck, a lean man in his 70s with kind eyes and a Marine Corps baseball cap. He approached Marcus and extended his hand. "Heard you're a fellow veteran," Tom said. "Afghanistan?" Marcus nodded. "Army. Lost my leg to an IED in Kandahar." Tom's grip was firm and respectful. "Vietnam for me. Lost some friends, but came home in one piece, physically at least." He gestured toward Thunder and Ghost. "These boys are lucky you found them. Let's get them somewhere they can heal proper." Loading the horses proved easier than Marcus had anticipated. Thunder and Ghost seemed to sense that this was another step toward safety. They walked up the trailer ramp with minimal coaxing, their massive hooves clanging against the metal, but their demeanor calm. Bill secured them carefully, making sure they had enough space and couldn't injure themselves during transport. Marcus rode in the trailer with them, unable to bear the thought of them being alone and frightened during the journey. Bill shook his head, but didn't argue. Stubborn as they come, he muttered with a hint of admiration. The drive to Tom's ranch took 40 minutes over snow-covered roads. Marcus sat on a bench in the trailer, watching Thunder and Ghost sway gently with the movement of the vehicle. They kept looking back at him, as if making sure he was still there. Every time their eyes met his, Marcus felt that same surge of connection, that unspoken bond that had formed in the darkness of the storm. These horses trusted him completely. It was a responsibility he didn't take lightly. Tom's ranch was everything Bill had promised and more. The stables were well maintained, with spacious stalls that had been freshly cleaned in preparation for their arrival. There was an indoor arena where the horses could exercise during bad weather, and miles of fenced pasture for when they were strong enough to run. Tom had even prepared special feed based on Sarah's recommendations, and had multiple water troughs already filled and ready. "This is incredible," Marcus said, looking around in amazement. "You didn't have to do all this." Tom smiled. "Yes, I did. These animals served humans their whole lives, worked for us, depended on us. When we fail them, we have a duty to make it right. Besides, it'll be good to have horses here again. Place has felt too empty since I sold the cattle." Unloading Thunder and Ghost was a moment Marcus would remember forever. As they walked down the ramp into their new home, both horses seemed to stand taller, their heads high with something that looked like dignity being restored. Tom led them to their stalls side by side so they could still see each other. He'd put fresh bedding down, thick and clean and soft. There were hay nets already filled, and water buckets positioned perfectly. Thunder entered his stall and immediately rolled in the bedding, a behavior Sarah had said was a sign of a horse feeling safe and comfortable. Ghost did the same, and both men laughed at the sight of these enormous animals acting like happy foals. Over the following weeks, Marcus visited Thunder and Ghost every single day. Tom had offered him a standing invitation to stay at the ranch as much as he wanted, and Marcus took him up on it more often than not. He learned how to properly care for draft horses under Tom's patient instruction. He learned about their diet, their exercise needs, their health requirements. He was there when the farrier came to trim their hooves, a process that took hours given their size. He was there when Sarah returned for follow-up visits, watching as Ghost's wounds healed and both horses gained weight steadily. The transformation was remarkable. Within a month, Thunder and Ghost looked like different animals. Their coats had regained their shine. Their eyes were bright and alert. They'd put on weight, their ribs no longer visible, their muscles filling out properly. They played in the snow like youngsters, chasing each other around the pasture with surprising speed and agility for creatures their size. But more than their physical recovery, it was their spirit that had returned. They were happy. They were alive in a way that went beyond just breathing and eating. They had hope again. The story of the rescue spread through Riverside and beyond. Local news picked it up, running a feature about the disabled veteran who'd driven into a record-breaking storm to save 2 abandoned horses. Marcus hated the attention, but he understood it served a purpose. Sarah used the publicity to push through the legal proceedings, and within 2 months, Marcus had full legal ownership of Thunder and Ghost. The Hendersons, facing animal cruelty charges and public outrage, didn't contest it. Good riddance was all Marcus said when Sarah told him the news. But the real impact of that night went deeper than headlines or legal documents. The community of Riverside, which had seemed so distant to Marcus when he first moved there, had opened up to him in ways he never imagined. People stopped him in town to ask about the horses, to offer help, to share their own stories of animals they'd rescued or loved. Bill gave him a standing discount at the feed store. Danny volunteered his time on weekends to help with barn work. Sarah became not just the horse's vet, but a genuine friend. And Tom, the old Marine, became something like the father Marcus had lost years ago, sharing wisdom about horses and life with equal generosity. Marcus's own life transformed along with the horses. The isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor began to crack and fall away. He started sleeping better, the nightmares that had plagued him since Afghanistan becoming less frequent. The phantom pain in his leg didn't disappear, but it bothered him less. He had a reason to get up in the morning that went beyond just surviving another day. He had Thunder and Ghost depending on him, and more than that, he had a community that had embraced him as one of their own. On a bright spring morning, 6 months after that terrible storm, Marcus stood in the pasture watching Thunder and Ghost graze peacefully. The snow had melted, revealing new grass that the horses cropped enthusiastically. They were magnificent now, fully recovered, their coats gleaming in the sunshine. Thunder lifted his head and looked at Marcus, then walked over, Ghost following close behind. Both horses lowered their massive heads, allowing Marcus to wrap his arms around their necks. He stood there between them, feeling their warmth, their strength, their trust, and understood finally what his therapist at the VA had tried to tell him for years. Healing wasn't about forgetting the past or erasing the scars. It was about finding purpose in the present and hope for the future. Those horses had cried out in the darkness, and Marcus had answered. In doing so, he'd saved 3 lives that night, including his own. The chains that had bound Thunder and Ghost were gone, cut away by bolt cutters and determination. But other chains had been broken too. The chains of isolation, of purposelessness, of believing that his best days were behind him. Marcus Weber, the disabled veteran who could barely take care of himself, had become Marcus Weber, the man who never gave up, who answered the call when others turned away, who proved that courage and compassion could overcome any obstacle. As he stood there with his horses in the warm spring sunshine, Marcus smiled. It was real smile, not the polite gesture he'd been offering the world for years. Thunder nickered softly and Ghost leaned into him, and Marcus knew with absolute certainty that this was where he belonged. Not in the past, not in the war, not in the darkness of depression and loss. But here, now, with 2 giant horses who'd been abandoned by the world and a community that had shown him what it meant to truly come home. The storm had passed, the chains were broken, and life, beautiful and unexpected, stretched out before them all.